So having gone in there with your paler shades in amongst these vivid streaks through here, so we've used that slightly paler peach, we've used the lilac, we've used the pink, the very pale pink that is. The next thing to do, and the final thing to do, is then go back in with a darker tone and just pick out some darker shadows. So I'm using that a mid lilac here. Now you don't want to go in here with the blue. This is almost a blue shade, but if you saw it independently of the orange, you would say it's definitely a lilac. Okay? As opposed to a blue. Let's get a blue next to it. You can see the difference there quite distinctly. And that's the blue I've been using further up, along with this purple here. Am I in focus there? Hopefully so. Now, do you see the difference between these two shades here? They're both purple. This is a much warmer purple. This is a much bluer purple. Don't use the bluer ones down next to the orange. It won't work. It will look very blue and it will look very brown. It will make the orange look quite brown next to it. Use the warmer shade. So this one here, the warm purple, the more pinky or reddish purple is the one to use. And even this one will look almost like you're putting blue because it's next to the orange. So just be aware of that you get a visual illusion and it looks like you're applying something that's this blue colour when actually you're applying something that's actually quite a warm purple because you're next to the orange. So just be cautious about what colour you put on. So I'm just going to go in here and use the side of that pastel, that long thin edge, and just draw on some of these more detailed, darker wisps, having done the light and the light wispy bits and so on. Now we've got some darker wisps to put on. So put a few of those in there, like this sort of thing here, and then drag them through with a shape just to sort of tone them in a little bit. And it's also useful for having in with just up against some of these bright areas. Just picking up the odd slightly darker shadow and a slightly darker edge inside these areas. Here and there are bits, just little dabs, so adding a little bit here and there. And just lift some of that bright colour a little bit. Again, looking at that edge there, just breaking up this edge over here and looking at how that blends into this light. So this is not as dark a shade as what we used over this far side here. So this edge here is a much darker colour than this edge I've put on here, even though on the photograph it's probably the same colour. But you never use the same very dark colour you've used over the edge here. You'd never use it over next to the pale colour, because again that optical illusion thing will look too dark. So then I get my shaper and just knock that in. Okay, so when you're doing your dark clouds and you're going along and adding darkness next to bright colours or darkness next to light colours, don't use the same shade. So I've got this very dark, really disc of purple here, and I will use that further over in this dark area here. But then as I get towards the edge, I'll go up a tone, and I'll make sure I switch to it being this, just a shade or two lighter, where it's next to the dark, and next to the light rather. So some of the final steps will be adding some little details on top of your sky. So what I've been doing at the moment is just working with a very pale blue. So it's one shade down from the blue I've been using over the rest of the piece. So that is that one there. Just the turquoise blue I've been using over everything, that's a very pale colour. The one next to it looks almost like a white, but it's not a white, as you can see there. It's just a slightly off shade of blue. So it's very nearly white, but not quite. I'm just using it to add some little final brighter areas in this main focal bit here, So I've put some pale areas down through here, and to do that what I'm doing is just using the flat side of the pastel, just dabbing some bits on top, adding a sort of mottled effect to the surface, and then just touching it in my finger just lightly. So not really blending very heavily, really quite delicate. But then when it comes to the edge of the cloud, like this bit here for example, what I've been doing is starting to press a bit harder with my pail, and then take that hardness right up to the edge of that grey, not the grey, sorry, right up to the edge of that purple cloud there, and just tip it up onto the edge slightly and just push it in to that purple cloud, just to create a nice cloud bank shape there, and then just be more delicate as you get further away, so you're kind of fading it out into this mottled effect in the middle here. And the same goes lower down. I'm just putting some patches of blue using the flat side of the pastels, that mottled effect again. But then when I get closer to the actual edge of the purple cloud, tip it up onto its edge and use the tip just to add in some little detailed bits. Then you sort of fade it out into the rest of it, this sort of mottled effect down here. And then as you get higher up, the same sort of thing applies. Mottling, and then as you get towards this area of pink cloud and this area of this purple cloud on this side, I'm going to go from using it quite flat in a very dabbing way to rolling it onto its long side and just slicing it a little bit in. So you just sort of take that into that purple cloud there and just slice it through. So you can see, you can then cut in and create little fingers of purple cloud coming out into it. And as far as blending goes, at that point you can blend however much you think is appropriate. So you might feel it's appropriate to blend very little and leave it. You might think it's appropriate to blend it by using a clean shaper. Where did I put my shaper tool? So you might blend it by using your shaper tool and just smooth it in that direction. You can also blend it by cutting the other way across it, which gives it a slightly more distorted look and just makes it slightly more feathery looking. And that's, I think, fairly effective because it means you don't have too many lines. What you can also do is just dab your finger lightly, and then when you get close to the edge of the cloud, don't touch the edge of the cloud, use the shaper and push the actual solid bit of cloud back up into that light and just break up that edge. So I'm just running up here with the shaper. Now for this bit I've rolled the shaper up onto its more of its tip, not completely upright, but it's not up to that, but it's just not quite horizontal, it's slightly rolled forward, so it gives me a slightly removal to the edge. It removes a bit of pastel as it goes along. So I'm just going along that edge there and just pushing up into it. And it can create a blur and it can create a sharp edge. Then you can go back in and you can then use your pastel and just do a little bit of dabbing in with that pale colour again and just cut in. Again to create that shaped edge. And again you're sort of creating that little bank of cloud here and soften as much as you think you need to. So it's very much a push-pull back and forward on these edges. The same goes with these sort of feathery fingers of light coming into here. It's sort of rolling up onto the edge of the pastel and just letting it come up into this area here a little bit and just give it a slight blur. Okay, so it's just creating some nice subtle details on top there. Now the other final thing to do is, having done that sort of thing with the light, you can also do a little bit with the dark. So that's that very weird flat disc of purple again, but it's quite handy for some dark bits. So along here, just add a little bit of dark in here. Just put some dabbing areas of dark that then will come down off into the rest of it over here. And then some little bits of dark in the far side of this cloud here. So where this cloud edge is here, then it's darker further across. Let me just zoom into a different position so you can see what I mean. Okay, so we're looking at this bit of cloud here with this little bit of purple. I'm just adding some darkness into it and just a bit more drama at these edges. So where that very bright colour is, I'm putting some darkness next to it. Just small dabbing marks you can see there, and I'm also then adding some dabs to imply a bit of movement with the cloud there. Just like that there. And then I'm going to use my shaper tool when it comes to it being close to the colour and just run it along very gently, because if you press too hard it'll just blur itself completely out. I want to leave that slightly textured look. If you press hard you'll lose all your mark making there. So I'm just going to drift it across, and there's no weight on my shaper there. I'm just letting the weight of the shaper itself pull the colour. I'm not pressing any extra pressure on it at all. If you find it's getting too linear, like I've just got a bit there, it's a bit too linear, I'm just going to go a slightly different direction across that and just go up and down a little bit diagonally through it, just to break that up slightly. And then when it comes to this mottled bit higher up though, I'm going to use my finger and just dab at it. So you take a bit off by your finger, then gathers a bit of the pastel on, as you can see just there. So it's gathered a bit of pastel on, but I can just dab and remove some, but also then push some in as well. So it just adds that sort of subtlety of colour, but gives that sense of movement in that cloud there. So the dynamic shapes are these streaks of colour coming across, but you also want some movement in the darker areas as well. So what we're doing here is the same dabbing effect. We're adding little bits of this very dark purple over here. I'm just adding a few bits on top, and I'm taking that swirl a little bit around that patch here, so it's going around that area there a little bit, and then taking it off into there. So just adding a little bit of mottling that dark area that's already there, but it's making it look slightly less consistent and slightly patchy. And again, dabbing at it with my finger just to knock it in. Then I'm going to just use my shaper through here, and the shaper will pull that pastel around a little bit and give it some movement. So I'm just taking a bit through there just to get that effect there of that swirl and pull that pastel around that bit there. So it's all kind of subtle movements on top now, just adding those little final finishing details. That's the crucial thing. So what we're going to talk about here then is just giving it that final look and deciding whether it's got the balance you want in the piece or not. So it's just making a judgment about whether you've got too much light in one area, not enough up here, or whether you've got too much dark over here, not enough over there, and so on and so forth. I find sometimes it's very hard to judge that in real life, in the flesh as it were, so I do find taking a photograph on the mobile phone really useful. So I take a photograph, crop it down, and then I think, right, okay, and it sort of suddenly things leap out at you, don't they? So, do try that with yours as well, and just make a decision about whether you've got the balance that you want. For example, I'm just going to break this little bit of dark up here. I think it's a bit too intense just here, and a little bit more through there as well, and just break up. So it's just addressing those little things, and it's not just a question of looking at the colour balance of the piece either. It's also a question of looking at the textural balance. So you don't want it looking too busy everywhere. You want to think, well, I've got most of the eye being drawn into this area here, so I've got more detail here, but you want aspects where it's easier on the eye, as it were, so it balances. So you've got areas where there may well be a lot of detail in the clouds, but we haven't put them in. Like there's a very detailed cloud bank here, for example, in the photograph, but I haven't really put it in, because I'm thinking, well, I don't really need more detail here, 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 and here. But then this area here is quite soft, so if I have a lot of detail here and nothing in between, then it's going to be soft, detailed, and not going to, balance the piece. So it's making that judgment more about where to blur it, where not to blur it. If you've done quite a lot of shaper work, you may also find that it's looking a bit too busy. So if need be, you can just use your little finger and go back over and just do some softening through some of those harsher marks, and just make them slightly easier on the eye. And I tend to do that towards the edges of the piece, so I'm going around the edges here and just knocking some of those shapes in a little bit, so that it's not too intense in some of those areas. So that's just your final steps, and we shall see what happens. I think I'm back there now. I'll give it a fresh look tomorrow. You know what it's like, it's best to look the next day, isn't it, and see what you think.